I was 29 when my fiancée, Rachel, suggested we spend a weekend in a remote cabin to unplug and take a break from our busy lives. It was late September 2021, and the crisp air hinted at the coming winter. We'd found the place on some vacation rental site, a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It was advertised as rustic but cozy, perfect for couples looking to escape the noise of the world. At first glance, it seemed perfect. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, and nothing but the forest around us. Felt like a chance to slow down. I'd been working long hours at my construction job, while Rachel's nursing shifts often kept her up all night. We rarely had time to sit and talk anymore. The idea of a quiet weekend together sounded great, so I didn't hesitate to book it. The drive took longer than expected. The directions the owner provided weren't very clear, and Google Maps struggled with the backroads. By the time we turned off the main highway onto the dirt trail leading to the cabin, the sun had already dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the woods. The gravel crunched under the tires as I followed the twisting path deeper into the forest. I remember how the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches thick and gnarled, almost blocking out the fading light. When we finally reached the cabin, I had to admit it looked charming in a way. It was small, with wooden siding and a steep, shingled roof. A stone chimney jutted out the side, and smoke curled lazily from the top, which was strange because the owner hadn't mentioned anyone being there before us. Rachel figured it was just a sign the place was well prepped, so we didn't question it. There was a shed a few yards away and an old, rusted pickup truck parked beside it. I assumed it belonged to the caretaker or whoever came to clean the place before guests arrived. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It felt like we'd stepped into another world, far removed from the noise of the city. We carried our bags inside, and the first thing I noticed was the musty smell. The cabin wasn't dirty, but it had that damp, earthy scent you'd expect from a place that spent most of its time empty. The furniture was simple: a worn leather couch, a small wooden dining table, and a pair of chairs near the stone fireplace. There was a loft above us with a mattress and some blankets, accessible by a narrow ladder. The kitchen was basic but functional, with an old propane stove and a small fridge that hummed faintly. It was cozy enough, and Rachel seemed thrilled. She lit a few candles and started unpacking while I went out to grab firewood. That's when I noticed something odd. Behind the shed, there was a large pile of wood stacked neatly against the wall. It wasn't the wood that caught my attention, but the smell. It was faint, but it lingered in the cool air. Something metallic, almost like blood. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the dampness of the wood or the way the forest seemed to hold on to scents. I grabbed a few logs and headed back inside, brushing off the uneasy feeling. That night, after dinner, we sat by the fire, listening to the crackling logs and the wind outside. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin felt too isolated, like we'd stepped too far away from the safety of the world. I chalked it up to nerves and fatigue. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of dark woods. It was natural to feel a little uneasy. At some point, Rachel fell asleep on the couch. I stayed up for a while, staring into the flames and listening to the faint creaks of the cabin settling. Then, just as I was about to head to bed, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from inside the cabin, but from outside, near the window. I froze, every nerve in my body on edge. I told myself it was probably a branch brushing against the glass. The wind had picked up, and the trees were swaying outside. But when I got up to check, there was no branch near the window. In fact, there were no trees close enough to cause that sound. I looked out into the darkness, but all I could see was the faint outline of the forest. I went back to the couch, trying to shake the unease, but the tapping started again. This time, it came from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen. It was deliberate, like someone knocking softly on the wood. I didn't want to wake Rachel, so I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside to check. The night was cold and still. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the shed, the woodpile, and the shadows of the trees. I walked around the cabin, scanning the area, but there was nothing there. No tracks, no signs of animals, nothing to explain the sound. I went back inside, locked the door, and double-checked all the windows. When I climbed into bed, Rachel stirred but didn't wake. I didn't tell her about the tapping. I didn't want to scare her or make her think I was overreacting. But as I lay there, staring at the slanted ceiling of the loft, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, the forest was quiet again, as if the night had erased whatever had unsettled me. Rachel wanted to go for a hike, so we packed some water and snacks and headed out. The trail behind the cabin was overgrown, but we followed it as it wound deeper into the woods. About half a mile in, we found an old campsite. There was a fire pit filled with ash and a couple of rusted cans scattered around. It looked like no one had used it in years, but something about it felt wrong. The ashes in the fire pit weren't as old as the rest of the site. They were gray and fresh, as if someone had been there recently. Rachel didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't stop thinking about it as we continued the hike. The woods felt different now, heavier somehow. Every sound seemed amplified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we got back to the cabin, I noticed something else. The door to the shed, which had been closed the day before, was now slightly ajar. I walked over to check it out, and that smell hit me again, stronger this time. It was overwhelming, like rotting meat. Inside the shed, I found tools hanging on the walls, old cans of paint, and a workbench covered in dust. But in the corner, there was a tarp covering something large. My stomach turned as I approached it. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I pulled back the tarp and saw what was underneath. A deer carcass, or at least what was left of one. Its ribs were exposed, the flesh torn and mangled, but it wasn't the work of an animal. The cuts were too clean, like they'd been made with a knife. I stumbled out of the shed, my heart racing. I didn't tell Rachel what I'd found. I didn't want to ruin the weekend, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Someone had been here, maybe still was. That night, the tapping came back, louder this time. It moved around the cabin, from window to window, like someone circling the house. Rachel woke up, and I could see the fear in her eyes. We stayed in bed, clutching each other, as the sound continued. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse somehow, heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. I got up, grabbed the fire poker, and crept downstairs. The front door was still locked, but the window by the kitchen was open, just an inch. I closed it and checked the rest of the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone. When I went back upstairs, Rachel was staring at the loft window. It was small, barely big enough for a person to fit through, but it was open now too. I don't know how we made it through the night, but when the sun finally rose, we packed our things and left. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin and saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. I still don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. We were never alone in that cabin. I wasn't thrilled about the business trip to the cabin. When Sarah, my boss, announced that our small team was heading out to a secluded cabin in the mountains to brainstorm ideas and boost creativity, I nodded along like the good employee I was. But inside, I was dreading it. Sarah was the type of boss who loved pushing her team into uncomfortable situations in the name of growth. I couldn't say no, not if I wanted to keep my job. The cabin was located about 2 hours outside of Denver, deep in the Rockies. It was supposed to be a high-tech retreat, no Wi-Fi, limited cell service, but plenty of natural inspiration. Sarah rented it through some private site that claimed the place was perfect for corporate team building. It sounded more like a nightmare to me. I'm a city guy. I like my apartment, coffee shops, and reliable internet. The idea of being isolated in the wilderness with my boss wasn't appealing. We arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon in early November. The air was cold, and patches of snow clung to the ground. The road leading to the cabin was narrow and winding, bordered by dense trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The SUV I had rented struggled to navigate the rough terrain, and I couldn't help but feel like the trees were closing in on us as we got deeper into the forest. The cabin itself was impressive, a 2-story wooden structure with large windows overlooking the valley below. It looked modern but still managed to blend into the wilderness around it. Sarah, of course, was enthusiastic, pointing out the incredible view and commenting on how much we'd accomplish over the weekend. I forced a smile and grabbed my bag, following her inside. The interior was just as sleek as the exterior. Polished wood floors, a massive stone fireplace, and a fully equipped kitchen. There were 4 bedrooms upstairs and an open living area with plush couches and a large dining table. It was the kind of place people would pay a fortune to rent on vacation, but all I could think about was how isolated we were. Remote was an understatement. My phone had lost signal about 15 minutes before we reached the cabin. Sarah told us there was a landline in case of emergencies, but otherwise we were cut off from the outside world. As the sun dipped below the mountains, the temperature dropped rapidly. We lit a fire in the fireplace and settled in for the evening. Sarah handed out a schedule for the weekend, brainstorming sessions during the day, followed by team bonding activities in the evening. It was all very corporate, but I kept my mouth shut. That night, I barely slept. My room was at the far end of the hall, and the silence was oppressive. I could hear every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind rattling the windows. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps outside my door, but when I opened it, the hallway was empty. The next day, we started our brainstorming sessions. Sarah was in her element, leading discussions and jotting down ideas on a large whiteboard she had brought. I tried to focus, but something about the cabin felt off. The longer we stayed, the more I noticed little things that didn't add up. The first was the landline. Sarah had mentioned it when we arrived, but when I went to use it on Saturday morning, it was dead. I thought maybe the line was just old, but it didn't sit right with me. Then there were the sounds. At first, I told myself it was just the natural noises of the forest. Branches snapping, animals scurrying through the underbrush. But on Saturday night, as I lay in bed, I heard something heavier. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. I stayed frozen in bed, straining to listen. The sound came from outside, circling the cabin. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but it sounded too human. I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, but it was too dark to see anything. The next morning, I mentioned the sounds to Sarah. She dismissed it, saying I was probably just hearing deer or elk. But I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. Her smile seemed forced, and she kept glancing at the windows as if she was expecting to see something. That afternoon, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The cabin had a trail leading down to a small stream, and I thought the fresh air might help me shake the unease that had been building since we arrived. As I walked, I noticed how quiet the forest was. Too quiet. About half a mile from the cabin, I found something strange. A small clearing with remnants of what looked like a campfire in the center. Surrounding it were crude wooden structures, almost like lean-tos, but they were too small for anyone to sleep in. Scattered around were items that didn't belong. A torn piece of fabric, an old shoe, and what looked like the rusted remains of a knife. I didn't stay long. The place gave me the creeps, and I hurried back to the cabin. That night, everything came to a head. We were sitting around the fireplace after dinner when the power went out. At first, we thought it was just a blown fuse, but when Sarah checked the breaker box, everything seemed fine. The cabin was plunged into darkness, lit only by the glow of the dying fire. Sarah lit some candles and we tried to stay calm, but the tension was palpable. The silence was broken by a loud thud from upstairs. Sarah and I both froze, staring at each other. Another thud, louder this time. It sounded like it came from my room. We grabbed flashlights and cautiously made our way upstairs. My heart was pounding as I pushed open the door to my room. It was empty, but the window was wide open. That's when we saw the footprints. Muddy prints leading from the window to the door, and then back out the way they came. They were human and they were fresh. We didn't sleep that night. We barricaded the doors and windows as best we could and waited for morning. When the sun finally rose, we packed our things and left the cabin without a word. On the drive back to Denver, Sarah kept glancing at the rearview mirror as if expecting someone to follow us. A week later, I got a call from Sarah. She had looked into the cabin's history and found out something disturbing. The property had been owned by a reclusive man who disappeared 10 years ago. His remains were never found, but hikers in the area occasionally reported strange encounters. Footprints in the snow, items missing from campsites, and sometimes even glimpses of a figure watching them from the trees. I haven't been back to the mountains since. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps outside my door. It was the winter of 2014, and I was stationed in a remote cabin deep in the Colorado Rockies. My role was clear: observe, report, and, if necessary, eliminate any threats to the high-value asset we were monitoring. The cabin was miles away from any signs of life, perched on the edge of a steep ridge overlooking a valley. The cold, the silence, and the isolation were the kind of things most people couldn't handle for long. But I wasn't most people. I thrived in solitude. The cabin itself was barely livable. It had been built for this specific purpose, a lookout station for long-term surveillance. The wood was rough and untreated, and the windows were small, with thick shutters to keep out the biting wind. Inside, there was a basic cot, a wood stove, a small table, and my gear. I had my rifle, my scope, and enough rations to last weeks. The radio was my only lifeline, but I kept it off unless I needed to check in. Radio silence was part of the job. I had been there for nearly 3 weeks, tracking a man named James Whitaker. He wasn't just any man. He was ex-military, dishonorably discharged for reasons no one talked about. Rumor was he had been running guns and drugs across the border, but that wasn't what concerned us. Whitaker had connections, dangerous ones, and my orders were to watch for any sign that he was meeting with someone or moving goods through the area. Most of the time, my days were uneventful. I'd watch through my scope, scanning the valley below, noting the occasional hiker or wildlife. Nights were worse. The cold seeped into my bones no matter how much wood I fed into the stove, and the darkness outside felt oppressive. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch in full gear, rifle resting on my lap, just to remind myself I wasn't trapped. On the 4th week, something changed. It started with footprints. I was making my usual morning rounds, checking for anything unusual around the perimeter of the cabin. The snow was fresh, untouched, except for a single set of boot prints leading up the ridge to the west. My heart rate kicked up. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and that was nearly impossible in this silence. I crouched low, following the trail until it disappeared into the trees. Whoever it was had come close, too close, and then turned back. I returned to the cabin, locked the door, and double-checked my rifle. The scope was clean, the barrel cold. I set up my position by the window, keeping my eye on the ridge where the tracks had come from. Hours passed, and nothing happened. No movement, no sound, just the wind cutting through the trees. By nightfall, I convinced myself it was probably a hiker who had wandered too close. Still, I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the tracks were gone, covered by a fresh layer of snow. But something else was wrong. The small pile of firewood I kept near the porch was scattered. Not just knocked over, but deliberately spread out. I checked my gear. Everything was where I left it, but the feeling that someone had been there, that they were watching me, was overwhelming. I spent the day scanning the valley, the ridge, and the tree line. My eyes burned from staring through the scope. I saw nothing, but I knew better than to trust my eyes. Whoever it was had been smart enough to avoid being spotted once. They'd do it again. That night, I heard the first sound. A low, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps in the snow, started far off, near the ridge, and grew louder. I killed the stove, plunging the cabin into darkness. I sat by the window, rifle at the ready, straining to see any movement outside. The footsteps stopped just as suddenly as they started. I waited, motionless, for what felt like hours, but there was nothing. The next morning, I found more tracks, this time circling the cabin. They were close, too close, and they hadn't been there before. Someone had been watching me all night. By now, I was on high alert. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. I started setting traps around the perimeter, simple ones like tripwires and noisemakers. They wouldn't stop anyone, but they'd at least give me a warning. For 3 days, there was nothing. I almost started to believe whoever it was had given up. Then the traps started going off. The first was just after dusk. A sharp clang of a tin can hitting the side of the cabin jolted me awake. I grabbed my rifle and peered out the window, but there was nothing. I reset the trap and waited. An hour later, another one went off, this time near the back. Whoever it was, they were testing me, wearing me down. The next night, they got bolder. I was sitting at the table, cleaning my scope, when I heard a soft tapping on the window behind me. My blood ran cold. The windows were high, too high for anyone to reach without a ladder. I turned slowly, rifle in hand, and saw nothing. The snow outside was undisturbed. I checked every window, every door, but everything was secure. That's when I realized they were playing with me. Whoever this was, they weren't trying to break in. They were trying to get inside my head. By the end of the week, I was barely sleeping. My food supply was running low, and the cold seemed to be getting worse. The traps went off every night, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time. I never saw anyone, never heard anything more than the occasional crunch of snow, but the feeling of being watched never left. On the 9th day of this madness, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for them to make the first move. I spent the morning preparing, checking my rifle, packing what little gear I had left. By noon, I set out, following the tracks that had appeared overnight. They led me up the ridge and deep into the forest. The snow was deep, slowing my progress, but I didn't stop. Hours passed as I followed the trail, and the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The tracks didn't lead anywhere, they just stopped, right in the middle of a clearing. No sign of a camp, no sign of anything. It was as if whoever had made them had simply disappeared. I stood there, scanning the trees, my breath fogging up the scope. That's when I saw it. A glint of metal high in the trees. A camera. They'd been watching me the whole time. My stomach dropped. This wasn't some lone hiker messing with me. This was planned, deliberate. I turned to head back to the cabin, but the forest felt different now. The silence wasn't just silence. It was oppressive, smothering. Every step I took felt like it echoed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting. I locked the door and pulled the heavy shutters closed. My hands were shaking as I checked the rifle again. I knew this wasn't over. Whoever they were, they'd been watching me for weeks, and now they knew I'd found their camera. That night, the cabin wasn't just surrounded, it was under siege. The traps went off one by one, followed by the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. The shutters rattled, the walls creaked, and every now and then, I'd hear that soft tapping on the windows. I stayed by the door, rifle aimed, waiting for the inevitable. Came just before dawn. A single gunshot rang out, shattering the silence. The bullet tore through the wall, missing me by inches. I returned fire, aiming blindly into the darkness. The sound of footsteps retreated, and then there was silence. When daylight finally came, I ventured outside. The snow was red, and there was a trail leading away from the cabin. I followed it for a mile before it disappeared into the trees. I never found a body, never saw who it was, but I knew they'd be back. I called in for extraction that morning, but it took 2 days for the team to reach me. By the time they arrived, I was out of food, out of ammo, and barely holding it together. I told them everything, but they didn't find any evidence. No tracks, no cameras, nothing. To this day, I don't know who it was or what they wanted. But I do know one thing: they were better than me, and that thought keeps me awake every single night. It was late October 2012, and the weather forecast had promised heavy rain for days. I was 29 back then, living in Oregon, and I had taken a week off from work to escape the monotony of city life. I didn't tell many people where I was going. I wanted complete isolation. I had rented a cabin deep in the Cascade Mountains, a simple one-room place surrounded by nothing but thick forest. I thought it would be peaceful, just me, the sound of rain, and a good book. The drive out was uneventful. Gray clouds loomed overhead, and the pine trees lining the winding mountain roads seemed darker than usual. I arrived at the cabin around noon. It was exactly as advertised: small, rustic, and isolated. A gravel driveway led to the front porch, and beyond that, the forest stretched endlessly. I unloaded my bags, locked the car, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like damp wood and pine needles. It had one room with a bed in the corner, a small kitchen with an old propane stove, and a wood-burning stove for heat. There was no electricity, but a few battery-powered lanterns sat on the shelves. I put my things down, took a deep breath, and smiled. This was exactly what I needed: a break from the noise and demands of life. The rain started just as I finished unpacking. It came down in a steady rhythm, tapping against the metal roof and the windows. I made some coffee on the propane stove and sat by the window, watching the forest disappear behind a curtain of rain. The rain didn't stop. By the time night fell, it had grown heavier, pounding against the roof like a drum. The cabin felt smaller in the dark, and the sound of the rain made it seem even more remote. I lit one of the lanterns, its soft glow pushing back the shadows, and climbed into bed. The wind picked up around midnight, howling through the trees. I could hear branches creaking and snapping outside. At one point, I thought I heard something heavier, a loud thud, like a tree falling nearby, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I fell asleep to the sound of the storm. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The wind was still howling, and the rain was still pouring. But there was something else, a faint noise that didn't belong. It was coming from outside. I sat up in bed and listened, holding my breath. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the wet gravel near the cabin. My first thought was that it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a bear, but the steps were too steady, too purposeful. I grabbed the lantern and held it up, its weak light barely illuminating the room. The sound stopped. I sat there for a long time, straining to hear anything over the storm. But there was nothing, just the rain and the wind. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a branch falling or some animal passing by. I put the lantern down and tried to go back to sleep, but it took a long time for my heart to stop racing. The rain didn't let up the next day. The sky was a dull, oppressive gray, and the forest looked darker than before. I tried to distract myself by exploring the cabin and chopping some wood for the stove. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was no cell service out here, which was part of the appeal when I booked the place. But now that isolation felt more like a threat. I kept looking out the window, expecting to see someone or something out there in the trees. By afternoon, I decided I was being ridiculous. I told myself I was just spooking myself, that the storm and the solitude were playing tricks on my mind. To prove it, I decided to go for a walk. I grabbed my raincoat and boots, stepped outside, and immediately regretted it. The rain was relentless, soaking me in seconds despite my coat. The forest was eerily quiet beneath the roar of the storm. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of water dripping and splashing everywhere. I walked for about 20 minutes, following a narrow trail that led away from the cabin. The ground was slippery with mud, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I kept telling myself I was fine, but my nerves were on edge. Every shadow, every movement caught my eye. Then I saw it. First, I thought it was just another fallen tree, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a tree at all. It was a backpack, soaked and muddy, lying in the middle of the trail. It didn't make sense. The cabin was miles from the nearest road, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone since I arrived. I hesitated, then walked over and crouched down to look at it. The backpack was old and worn, the kind you'd expect to see on a long-distance hiker. It was partially unzipped, and inside I could see a few items: a water bottle, a rolled-up map, and a flashlight. There was no ID, no sign of who it belonged to. I stood up and looked around, but there was no one there. The forest was empty, silent except for the rain. I thought about taking the backpack back to the cabin, but something about it made my skin crawl. I left it where it was and hurried back down the trail. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain was louder than ever, and every noise made me jump. I kept thinking about the backpack, about how it had gotten there and who it might belong to. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer, right outside the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. They stopped by the front door, then started again, circling the building. I grabbed the lantern and crept to the window. The rain made it hard to see, but I thought I saw something, a shadow moving just beyond the porch. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted me to know they were there. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, there was a loud bang against the door. I didn't think. I grabbed the fire poker from beside the stove and held it tightly. The banging continued, heavy and deliberate, like someone was trying to break the door down. And then it stopped. I stood there in the dark, the poker in my hands, waiting for the next sound. But it never came. By morning, the rain had finally stopped. The forest was drenched, water dripping from every leaf and branch. I stepped outside, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of what had happened the night before. The ground around the cabin was covered in footprints. Large, muddy prints that circled the building and led off into the woods. I didn't stay to find out where they went. I grabbed my things, threw them in the car, and drove away as fast as I could. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out who or what was out there in the rain. But sometimes, when it storms at night, I can still hear those footsteps, slow and deliberate, outside my window. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet escape. That's what I told myself as I packed the last of my gear into the truck and set off for a week alone. The place was remote, sitting near the United States border in the wilderness of Arizona, tucked into a dense pocket of scrubby pines and rocky hills. It was late October, just cool enough at night to make you shiver but warm under the sun during the day. The perfect time to disappear into the solitude of nature. I'd rented the cabin online. The listing was sparse, just a few grainy photos of the place, a brief description about it being off the grid and perfect for hikers or hunters, and a note warning that cell service was non-existent. That suited me just fine. After the grind of city life, I wanted to unplug completely. I figured I'd spend my days hiking the trails and my nights curled up by the fireplace with a book. The drive out there took most of the day. As the roads got narrower and the towns grew farther apart, I felt the stress of everyday life easing away. By the time I turned onto the unmarked dirt path leading to the cabin, I felt almost peaceful. The path wound through low hills, the tires kicking up dust as I crawled along at a cautious speed. It wasn't until I saw the cabin that something shifted. It looked like the pictures, small, wooden, with a sloping tin roof, but there was something about it that felt different in person. The windows were dark, reflecting the surrounding trees like mirrors, and the front porch sagged just enough to make me wonder if it was sturdy. The place had a weathered, forgotten feel, like it had been standing there for decades without anyone giving it much thought. I parked the truck and killed the engine, stepping out into the stillness. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint whisper of the wind through the trees. I shrugged off the unease and grabbed my bag, telling myself I was just tired from the long drive. The door creaked when I opened it, and the air inside smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. The cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen in the corner, a table and 2 chairs, and a couch that looked older than I was. A narrow door led to the bedroom, and beyond that, a tiny bathroom with a cracked mirror. Everything was clean enough, but it felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a sense that I wasn't really alone. I shook the thought off and started unpacking. The first night passed uneventfully. I built a fire in the stone hearth, ate a quick meal, and read until my eyes grew heavy. The wind picked up as I lay in bed, rattling the loose window panes and whistling through unseen cracks. I told myself it was just the way old cabins were, creaky and drafty, and eventually drifted off to sleep. The next day, I set out to explore. The area around the cabin was rugged, a mix of rocky terrain and scraggly trees. The trails weren't well marked, but I'd brought a map and compass, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I spent hours wandering, taking in the sharp scent of pine and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. I didn't see another soul, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. But when I returned to the cabin that afternoon, something wasn't right. The door was ajar just slightly, enough to notice. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I was certain I'd locked it before leaving. My first thought was that an animal had gotten in, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. But when I stepped inside, everything was as I'd left it. My bag was untouched, the kitchen counters bare, the couch undisturbed. I checked every corner, even under the bed and inside the closet. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I double-checked the lock on the door and spent the rest of the evening trying to convince myself it was just the wind or my own mistake. That night, the unease grew. I woke up several times, convinced I'd heard something outside. A soft crunch of gravel, the creak of wood. Each time, I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the sounds never repeated. By morning, I was exhausted and jumpy. On the 3rd day, I decided to hike further out, hoping the exercise and fresh air would clear my mind. I packed a small lunch and set out early, following a dry creek bed that wound deeper into the hills. The landscape grew rougher, the trees thinning out to reveal jagged rocks and open sky. It was beautiful in a harsh, lonely way. But as the sun climbed higher, I started to feel like I was being watched. It was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of my neck, a vague sense of unease. I stopped several times, scanning the trees and rocks for any sign of movement. Nothing. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. When I reached a ridge overlooking the valley below, I found something that made my blood run cold. There, in the dirt, were footprints. They weren't mine. The tread was different, the size larger. They looked fresh, the edges still sharp, leading away from where I stood. I followed them for a short distance, my heart pounding. They led down the slope, disappearing into a cluster of rocks and scrub. I didn't dare go further. Instead, I turned back, moving as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the clearing. I locked the door behind me and checked the windows, making sure every latch was secure. The cabin felt smaller than before, the walls pressing in around me. That night, the noises started again. This time, they were louder footsteps on the porch, the faint scrape of something against the wood. I stayed frozen in bed, clutching the heavy flashlight I'd brought with me. Hours passed, the sounds coming and going, until finally silence returned. The next morning, I found scratches on the front door, deep, jagged marks as if someone or something had tried to get in. My stomach churned as I stared at them, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I knew I couldn't stay there another night. I spent the day packing up, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes on me as I loaded my gear into the truck. When I was finally ready to leave, I paused on the porch, looking back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure in the trees, just at the edge of my vision. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, half hidden by the shadows. My chest tightened, and I scrambled into the truck, starting the engine with shaking hands. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the figure was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. When I finally checked my phone, there were dozens of missed calls and messages from friends and family. Apparently, the area I'd been in had a reputation. Stories of disappearances, strange sightings, and warnings to stay away. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, I can't explain what happened. All I know is that I wasn't alone out there, and whatever or whoever was watching me didn't want me to leave. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. I had been saving up for years, and finally, in the fall of 2022, I bought a small piece of land deep in the woods of Maine. I wanted a place where I could escape the noise of life, a place that felt untouched, serene, and mine. The land came with a rundown cabin that had been abandoned for years. It wasn't much, just a small, single-room structure made of rotting wood and a tin roof, but I planned to restore it. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, about 20 miles from the nearest town. When I first arrived, I noticed how quiet the place was. Not just quiet like a library, quiet like the air itself was holding its breath. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional call of a bird. It was peaceful, but something about it felt off. Still, I chalked it up to nerves. I was a city guy after all, and this kind of isolation was new to me. I spent the first few days clearing out debris. The previous owner had left behind piles of old tools, broken furniture, and other junk. I hauled everything out and burned it in a fire pit I dug behind the cabin. The work was hard, but I enjoyed it. There was something satisfying about seeing progress with my own hands. By the end of the first week, the cabin was empty, and I started working on repairs. The roof needed patching, the floorboards creaked like they might give way at any moment, and the windows were nothing more than jagged holes. but I was determined to make it livable. It was on the second week that I noticed the carvings. I had been stripping the walls to replace the old, rotting planks when I saw them. Small, intricate designs etched into the wood. They were everywhere, covering almost every surface of the cabin. At first, I thought they were just random scratches, but the more I looked, the more I realized they were deliberate. Most of the carvings were geometric patterns, triangles, circles, and lines that twisted and intersected in strange ways. Others were more abstract, like animals or plants, but they weren't any species I recognized. The wood around the carvings was smoother than the rest, as if they had been polished by hand. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the previous owner had been some kind of artist or just bored out here in the middle of nowhere. I ran my fingers over the designs, tracing the grooves. They felt oddly warm. Even though the cabin was cold and damp, I decided to leave the carvings alone. They were kind of beautiful in a strange way, and I figured they added character to the place. About a week after discovering the carvings, I started hearing the noise. It was late one night, and I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The cabin was pitch black except for the faint glow of the moon through the gaps in the roof. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it. A low, rhythmic creaking, like footsteps on old wood. I froze, holding my breath. The sound came from outside, near the front porch. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. I grabbed the flashlight from beside my bed and shone it out the window, but I didn't see anything. The forest was still, the trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the sound didn't stop. It went on for what felt like hours, until I finally fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I checked the area around the cabin. There were no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate anything had been there. Over the next few days, the carvings seemed to change. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the patterns looked different. New lines appeared where there hadn't been any before. Shapes shifted, twisting into new forms. One night, I decided to take a closer look. I brought my flashlight and studied the walls, trying to figure out if I was losing my mind. That's when I noticed something strange. The wood felt soft, almost like flesh. When I pressed my finger against one of the carvings, the wood seemed to give, then slowly spring back into place. I recoiled, my heart pounding. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A week later, the smell started. It was faint at first, a sour, earthy odor that I couldn't quite place. I thought maybe something had died under the cabin, so I crawled underneath to check. What I found made my stomach turn. There was a pile of bones, small animal bones, scattered beneath the cabin. They were clean, picked bare, but they didn't look old. Some of them still had bits of flesh clinging to them, and the smell was overpowering. I backed out quickly and decided to leave it for another day. But when I went back the next morning, the bones were gone. By now, I was starting to lose sleep. The noise outside had returned, louder and more frequent. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was scratching, thudding, and sometimes what sounded like whispering. I knew I should leave, but something kept me there. I don't know if it was pride, stubbornness, or just plain stupidity, but I couldn't bring myself to abandon the cabin. Then, one night, everything came to a head. I woke up to the sound of wood groaning, like the entire cabin was alive and shifting. The walls seemed to pulse, the carvings writhing in the dim light of my flashlight. The floor buckled beneath me, and I stumbled to my feet. That's when I saw it. The wood was bleeding. Dark, viscous liquid oozed from the carvings, pooling on the floor. The smell was unbearable, like rot and decay. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my bag and ran out the door, not bothering to look back. I drove straight to town and never returned. I heard later that the cabin burned down in a wildfire, or at least that's what they said. Sometimes, I wonder if it wasn't something else, something in the wood, something that didn't want me there. Even now, I can't get the image out of my head. The carvings, the blood, the way the cabin seemed to breathe. I don't know what was in that wood, and I don't want to know. I rented the cabin to get away from everything. The constant hum of the city, the deadlines, the never-ending emails. Everything was closing in on me. I needed peace, and I thought a week in the woods would be just what I needed. It was an online listing, a small, isolated cabin in the Adirondacks. The pictures showed a cozy wooden structure with a stone fireplace, surrounded by tall trees and endless wilderness. It looked perfect. The drive out there was long but beautiful. The paved road gradually gave way to gravel, and then finally to a dirt path. The further I went, the fewer signs of people I saw. No other cars, no houses, just trees. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the photos. It sat on a slight hill, with a small front porch and a view of the woods that seemed to stretch forever. Inside, it was simple but comfortable. A small kitchen with outdated appliances, a single bedroom with a lumpy bed, and a living room with a large stone fireplace. There was no TV or internet, just a shelf of books and a few old board games. It was quiet, which was exactly what I wanted. I spent the first day settling in. I unpacked my food and clothes, made myself a simple dinner, and read until it got dark. The silence was a little unnerving at first, but I told myself I'd get used to it. I fell asleep to the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to explore the area. There was a trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. I packed a bottle of water and some snacks and set off. The air was cool and smelled of pine, and the only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional bird call. After about an hour, I came across an old, overgrown trail that split off from the main one. It wasn't marked, and it didn't look like anyone had used it in years. Something about it made me uneasy, but I was curious, so I followed it. The trail led to a clearing with the remains of an old building. It looked like it had been a cabin once, but it was little more than a crumbling foundation and a few rotting beams now. There were rusted tools scattered around, and what looked like the remnants of a fire pit. Felt strange, like I shouldn't be there. I didn't stay long. I took a few pictures with my phone and headed back to the main trail. By the time I got back to my cabin, it was late afternoon. I felt a little uneasy, but I brushed it off. It was just an old ruin, probably abandoned decades ago. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, and it howled through the trees, making the cabin creak. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, rustling in the underbrush. I told myself it was just animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. The next day, I decided to stay closer to the cabin. I spent the morning chopping wood for the fireplace and cleaning up around the property. In the afternoon, I sat on the porch with a book, but I couldn't focus. I kept looking up at the woods, half expecting to see someone watching me. As the sun started to set, I noticed something strange. In the distance, through the trees, I saw a faint light. It looked like a lantern or a flashlight moving slowly. It was too far to be on my property, but it was close enough to make me uneasy. I went inside and locked the door. I told myself it was probably just a hiker or a hunter, but I couldn't stop thinking about the old trail and the ruined cabin. What if someone was living out there? That night was worse than the one before. The wind had died down, but the noises outside seemed louder. I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, clutching the fire poker. The footsteps would stop for a while, then start again. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun came up, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things and loaded them into the car. I didn't want to spend another night out there. As I was leaving, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt driveway, there were footprints. They were fresh and they weren't mine. I drove out of there as fast as I could. As the cabin disappeared in my rearview mirror, I felt a sense of relief, but also something else: fear. A week later, I got a call from the property owner. He asked if I had left the cabin unlocked. I told him I hadn't. He said the cleaning crew had found the door wide open and the inside trashed. Furniture was overturned, drawers were emptied, and there were deep scratches in the wooden floors, like someone had dragged something heavy across them. They also found something else: a single lantern sitting in the middle of the living room floor. It wasn't mine.